Yuba County, California. 1978. 5 men disappear after a routine trip home. Their car is later found abandoned in the mountains. Nothing about it suggests they needed to leave. If you enjoy this kind of story, please subscribe, like, and share the video. It really helps the channel grow. Let's begin. On a cold evening in February 1978, 5 young men from Yuba County set out for what was meant to be a simple trip. They were close friends, known for spending time together, and that night they decided to attend a college basketball game in Chico, California. It was not an unusual plan. The drive was familiar, the destination routine. The game ended late in the evening. Afterward, the group began their return trip home. Before leaving Chico, they stopped at a convenience store to buy snacks for the drive. This brief stop would later become a critical reference point, as it was the last confirmed sighting of all 5 men together. According to available accounts, there was nothing remarkable about the stop. The men appeared calm and unhurried. There were no reports of conflict, confusion, or distress. They bought food and drinks, returned to their car, and drove away into the night. Under normal circumstances, they should have arrived home shortly after. When they did not, concern began to grow among their families. Hours passed with no phone calls and no sign of delay. By the next day, all 5 men were officially reported missing. Early assumptions focused on the possibility of an accident or a navigational error. However, as investigators began reviewing the timeline, it became clear that something did not align with a simple mistake. The men had not followed the route they were expected to take. Instead of heading south toward Yuba County, their vehicle had traveled in the opposite direction. This change in direction would become one of the defining features of the case. The road they took led away from populated areas and into the mountains of Northern California. In February, these elevations were often covered in snow, and nighttime temperatures dropped rapidly. The men were dressed for a short drive, not for prolonged exposure to winter conditions. There was no clear reason for them to be in that area. The road did not serve as a shortcut, nor did it lead to any known destination connected to the group. Yet for reasons that remain unclear, they continued driving deeper into the mountains. As the night passed, the absence of any contact only deepened the mystery. There were no emergency calls, no messages, and no witnesses who reported seeing the vehicle after it left Chico. What happened during those first hours remains undocumented. By the time search efforts began, the case was no longer about a group of men who were late returning home. It had become a disappearance defined by a single, unexplained decision, a turn onto a road they were never supposed to take, and a growing silence that would stretch on for months. That silence would soon be broken, but not in a way that brought clarity. Reconstructing the men's route became one of the first priorities for investigators. Based on the location of the convenience store and the place where the vehicle was later found, it was clear that the group had not taken the road home. Instead of traveling south toward Yuba County, they drove east, away from cities, highways, and any form of immediate assistance. This was not a minor deviation. By the time the car was discovered, it was nearly 80 kilometers from the route they were expected to follow. The road they chose climbed steadily into mountainous terrain, passing through remote forest areas that saw little traffic, especially at night. The decision raised immediate questions. The road did not function as a shortcut. It did not lead to another town or destination connected to the men. There were no services along the way, no gas stations, no places to stop for help. Continuing forward meant entering an area where winter conditions could quickly become dangerous. February in Northern California, mountains often brought heavy snow at higher elevations, along with rapidly falling temperatures after sunset. Visibility was limited, and large sections of forest were unlit and isolated. Anyone traveling into those areas without preparation would have been taking a significant risk. There was no clear evidence that the men were lost in a conventional sense. The road was marked, and at several points they could have turned around and headed back toward Chico. Instead, the vehicle continued deeper into the mountains, climbing farther away from populated areas with each passing kilometer. Investigators found no indication of a roadblock, accident, or sudden emergency that would have forced them to take this route. There were no reports of severe weather at lower elevations that night that would have prevented a normal drive home. Nothing suggested that they were fleeing danger or attempting to reach safety. The longer the route was examined, the more puzzling the decision became. Driving into the mountains meant leaving behind familiar roads and increasing the distance between themselves and help. It was a choice that offered no obvious benefit and carried growing risk. This unexplained change in direction would shape the entire investigation. Everything that followed, from the location of the abandoned vehicle to the eventual discoveries made in the forest, stemmed from this single decision. Whatever led the men onto that road, it altered the course of the night and placed them in an environment they were not prepared to face. By the time search efforts began to expand into the mountains, investigators were no longer asking where the men had gone. They were asking why they had gone there at all. Several days after the disappearance, search efforts expanded east of Chico into the mountainous forest roads the men had traveled. It was there, high in the snow-covered terrain, that investigators located the group's vehicle. The car was found parked on a remote forest road, far from any town or service area. It was not crashed and showed no signs of impact. It had been positioned deliberately along the side of the road, as if the driver had chosen to stop rather than being forced to. The vehicle was not buried in snow. Although snow surrounded the area, the tires were not trapped, and the car could have been pushed free by several people working together. Investigators confirmed that there was fuel in the tank and that the engine was capable of running. Nothing about the car suggested an emergency. Inside, personal belongings were still present. There were no signs of a struggle, no damage to the interior, and no indication that the men had been forced out. The keys were missing, but otherwise the vehicle appeared intact and usable. Under normal circumstances, the car would have provided shelter from the cold and a clear point of reference for search teams. Remaining with the vehicle would have significantly increased the chances of being found. Instead, the men had chosen to leave it behind. Footprints in the snow led away from the car and into the forest. The tracks showed that the men had walked on foot, not run. The direction of the prints indicated that they moved uphill, away from the road and farther into the mountains. At the time the car was abandoned, the area would have been extremely dark. There were no streetlights, no nearby buildings, and little traffic. Temperatures dropped sharply at night, and snow covered much of the surrounding terrain. The men were wearing light clothing suitable for a short drive, not for extended exposure to winter conditions. Investigators were unable to determine why the men chose to leave the safety of the vehicle. There was no evidence of mechanical failure that would have made staying impossible. There was no sign of an external threat that would have forced them into the forest. The abandoned car became a central focus of the case. It represented a moment when a different decision could have changed the outcome entirely. Whatever had happened before the vehicle stopped, It had led 5 men to walk away from the shelter, transportation, and visibility, and into an environment that offered none of those things. From that point forward, the search was no longer about locating a missing car. It was about finding 5 men who had stepped into the mountains and vanished. Once the abandoned car was discovered, the search intensified and shifted fully into the surrounding mountain terrain. Investigators and rescue teams began working outward from the vehicle, attempting to determine where the men had gone after leaving the road. Conditions made progress slow and difficult. Snow covered much of the area, hiding footprints and obscuring terrain features. In some places, snow reached depths that made travel on foot dangerous, even for trained searchers. Weather in the mountains changed quickly, limiting the time teams could safely operate. Initial efforts focused on following the footprints leading away from the car. These tracks were visible for short distances, but snowfall and wind soon erased them. The trail could not be followed continuously, leaving search teams without a clear direction. As days passed, the operation expanded. Law enforcement, Forest Service personnel, and volunteers searched forest roads, clearings, and natural routes through the terrain. Aircraft were used when weather allowed, but dense tree cover and uneven ground limited visibility from the air. Despite the scale of the effort, no sign of the men was found. There were no discarded items of clothing, no makeshift shelters, and no evidence of campfires. The forest offered no clues that explained where the men had gone or how they had survived in such conditions. As winter continued, it became increasingly clear that the search could not be sustained indefinitely. Snowfall increased, access routes became impassable, and the risk to searchers grew. Authorities were forced to scale back operations, concluding that further progress would likely require the arrival of spring. The case entered a period of uncertainty. With no new information and no confirmed sightings, investigators could only wait. Families were left without answers, and the mountains remained silent. When the snow finally began to melt months later, the search would resume. What emerged from the forest would provide partial answers, but it would also introduce new questions that proved far more difficult to explain. When winter began to loosen its grip on the mountains, search efforts resumed. As snow melted and access improved, areas that had been unreachable for months could finally be examined. What search teams discovered did not bring clarity. It raised new questions. The first bodies were found outdoors, scattered across the forested terrain, at varying distances from the abandoned car. Each discovery confirmed the same outcome. The men had survived for some time after leaving the vehicle, traveling on foot through snow and uneven ground before succumbing to the elements. Autopsies later determined that 4 of the men had died from hypothermia. There were no confirmed signs of fatal injuries caused by violence. No evidence of a struggle was found at the locations where they were discovered. The distances involved were significant. The men had traveled far beyond what would normally be expected for someone dressed in light clothing and unprepared for winter conditions. The terrain they crossed was steep in places, snow-covered and physically demanding. Their positions suggested that they had not all collapsed in the same area. Instead, they were found spread across the landscape, indicating that the group may have become separated over time. Whether this separation was intentional or the result of exhaustion remains unknown. Investigators document the scenes carefully, but the passage of time limited what could be learned. Months of exposure had altered clothing, disturbed tracks, and removed many potential clues. Snowmelt, wildlife, and weather had reshaped the landscape long before the bodies were found. One man remained unaccounted for. As attention turned farther into the forest, search teams began examining remote structures and locations that could have offered shelter. It was during this phase of the search that investigators identified a ranger trailer deep in the mountains, far beyond the location of the abandoned car. The discovery of this structure would lead to the most troubling findings of the entire case. Up to that point, the deaths could be understood, if not explained, as the result of exposure. What was found next would challenge that understanding, introducing details that did not align with simple survival logic. The forest had revealed 4 answers. It still held one more. The final discovery was made deep in the forest, far beyond the location of the abandoned car. Roughly 30 kilometers away, search teams reached a remote trailer used seasonally by forest rangers. The structure was intended as a survival shelter, stocked with supplies for extended stays in harsh conditions. Inside the trailer, investigators found Ted Wire, one of the 5 men. He was lying on a bed wrapped in blankets. Unlike the others, he had not died outdoors. His body showed no signs of fatal injury caused by violence. What made the discovery disturbing was not where he was found, but how long he had survived. The autopsy revealed that Ted had not died shortly after the group disappeared. Evidence indicated that he had lived inside the trailer for an estimated 8 to 12 weeks. During that time, he lost a severe amount of weight, nearly half of his normal body mass. The official cause of death was determined to be starvation combined with exposure. The trailer itself raised immediate and difficult questions. It was stocked with food supplies, including military-style canned rations sufficient to last a single person for months, possibly longer. Only a small number of cans had been opened. Several others remained untouched. The trailer was also equipped with a propane heating system. The propane tank was full and connected. To activate the heater, a single valve needed to be opened. It was never used. Nearby, investigators found matches, paper, and firewood stored next to the stove. No attempt had been made to start a fire. Ted had shelter, he had food, he had heat within reach. Yet he remained in cold, dark conditions and slowly starved. Investigators could not determine why. There was no evidence that Ted was physically unable to access the supplies. There was no indication that the trailer had been damaged or that the resources were unusable. It also remains unclear whether Ted reached the trailer alone or with others, and whether the other men were still alive at that point. No definitive timeline could be established for when the trailer was first entered. The discovery transformed the case. Up until that moment, the deaths could be understood as the result of exposure after a series of poor decisions. The trailer introduced a different kind of mystery, one that could not be explained by weather alone. Why had the men abandoned a functional vehicle? Why had they continued deeper into the forest? And why had Ted Wire failed to use the resources that could have saved his life? The case was eventually closed without a definitive explanation. Authorities concluded that the men became lost and died due to environmental exposure. However, many aspects of their behavior, particularly in the final weeks, were never fully explained. The Yuba County file remains unresolved, not because evidence is missing, but because the evidence that exists does not fit together.